The story of Mothman is often heavily abbreviated. People oftentimes have wildly different starting points. Some people may know to start in Clendenin, others may start with the Scarberries. However, most people cut out a lot of the weirdness around the Mothman scare. The whole story involves aliens and UFOs and a few con men too. In my opinion, you have to start with the story of Indrid Cold and Woodrow Derenberger. It's November 2nd, 1966, 10 days before the first reported sighting of Mothman. Woodrow Derenberger is driving down West Virginia back roads at night when he's forced from the road by an unknown craft. After his car settled underneath a bridge, the craft descends and a man emerges. The first thing he says to Woodrow, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm." So far, it sounds pretty much like any first encounter with an ET. But Indrid has something else in mind. Derenberger probably seems an obscure character from a UFO sighting. But let me be clear, his contemporaries thought anything but. His story went far beyond the mountains of West Virginia. They were played to servicemen in Vietnam, and reporters from as far as Australia and Japan descended on Parkersburg, West Virginia to report his encounter. Derenberger described the UFO as the shape of a glass chimney of an old-fashioned kerosene lamp lying on its side with a dome-like top. It was charcoal gray, with no lights coming from it, and floated above the road, never touching down. Derenberger described the man who emerged from the UFO as looking like anyone else from the street. He appeared to be 35 to 40 years old, close to 6 feet tall, and weighing around 185 pounds. He was tan, with dark brown hair. When Indrid spoke, Derenberger heard him clearly, which is only strange because the window was rolled up at the time. And throughout the conversation, he told him not to be afraid. They only wished him happiness. The conversation started off germane enough. Indrid asked Mr. Derenberger what the city of Parkersburg was called. Derenberger responded that it's Parkersburg, and they call it a city. Indrid told him that they referred to it as a gathering. Indrid then indicated that he was from another galaxy and referred to a place called Lanulos, specifically calling it a country, and saying that it's less powerful than yours. The conversation went on for 10 to 15 minutes, and they discussed cities and towns, population, climate, and oddly enough, the farming livestock in the area. Reflecting back on the conversation, Derenberger realized that the conversation may have been entirely telepathic. After his encounter, Mr. Derenberger became the center of a media storm. Glenn Wilson, a local reporter, interviewed him. From those tapes, you can hear the sincerity and fear in Mr. Derenberger as he relates much of the tale that I've already told you. The only new information from those tapes is that he was interviewed by the U.S. military, an all too common occurrence in UFO sightings. By now, you're probably wondering what this has to do with Mothman. The connection comes not through Indrid, but the visitors that followed him. You're probably familiar with their box office hit, starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Men in Black descended on Parkersburg much like they did Point Pleasant, after the Mothman sightings began. This, in conjunction with the closeness in time, I think it's reasonable to consider the two connected. The Men in Black phenomena is one that many UFO sighters and abductees and various other people have reported. They are often described as odd, almost robotic, and what's worse is they often have an eerie sense of what you're thinking. Most have reported that they have communicated telepathically with them in their brief encounters. They come in groups and ask questions about your sightings of a UFO. They often are described as threatening, typically telling the person to keep quiet about what they've seen. This exact phenomena happened to Derenberger and those who saw Mothman. In the case of Derenberger, he was visited by 3 men in black who threatened to keep him quiet about what he had seen. What's weird, though, and may belie what was happening to Derenberger, was that he was telepathically contacted by Indrid following the visit from the Men in Black. He was asked to make a clearing at Boggle Run, a place not far from Mineral Wells, West Virginia. Mr. Derenberger went with friends and family, but no one save for Mr. Derenberger saw the ship. However, Indrid would often tell Mr. Derenberger times to look for lights in the sky, and family members always saw them at the time promised. Whether or not Mr. Derenberger encountered an alien that night is unclear. You could draw the conclusion that he's telling the truth, that he was looking for attention, or he was plagued with hallucinations. What is clear is that there is a coincidental connection between him and Mothman. They are so contemporaneously close to suggest some sort of connection, especially given that they both garnered worldwide attention. Moreover, there are other accounts of meetings with a strange man that night, some that aren't quite as believable or as well documented as Mr. Derenberger, but they do seem to widen the story. In one such encounter, the alien warned that humanity will need to make changes to avoid conflict and respect the environment. An eerie omen from the 60s. These warnings almost seem to complement Mothman's danger warnings. The first Mothman sighting is hard to pin down. While the first reported sighting is definitively the one by the Scarberry and Malay families, there are local legends that may place Mothman as early as 1960 or 1961. The first sighting with attributable names seems to be in a Clendenin cemetery on November 12, 1966. Kenneth Duncan was digging a grave with 4 other men when a tall humanoid figure flew out of the woods and over their head. At the time, they didn't make much of the sighting, but because of later reporting, they connected the dots. Not much else is known about the sighting. The next contemporaneous sighting was on November 14th, 1966 at 10:30 p.m. in Doddridge County, some 103 miles away from Clendenin. Merle Partridge was sitting at home watching TV with his son while his family was fast asleep. The TV started to experience some interruption, and that wasn't especially unusual in rural West Virginia at the time, but it seemed to be something more than interference as the TV started to emit a loud sound like an engine. At the same time, the family dog, Bandit, a German Shepherd, started to howl in an unsettling and unfamiliar way. When Merle investigated, he saw Bandit leering at the hay barn door. Bandit was clearly on edge. Curious and ready to get Bandit out of trouble, Merle got a flashlight and headed out the door. Bandit wasn't anywhere in sight, but he was wailing. Merle shone the light at the barn door and caught a glimpse of a pair of eyes that looked like bicycle reflectors. Merle was filled with dread. He said that it was as if he knew something was really wrong, but couldn't place just what it was. Bandit bolted for the red eyes. Too afraid to say put, Merle went back inside. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Merle and his son went to find Bandit and inspect the barn. The only thing they found in the barn was Bandit's tracks going around in circles and claw marks in the dust. Bandit was never seen again. However, a German Shepherd body was found not far from the TNT plant where the Scarberries had their first encounter. Outside of Bandit's disappearance and presumed death, Mothman has no other allegations of directly harming people or animals. The very next evening, Roger and Linda Scarberry, along with their friends Steve and Mary Millay, were out for a drive near the outskirts of Point Pleasant, where the old TNT plant was. Near the wildlife station, they spotted what appeared to be 2 red lights. As they approached the lights, they realized that the glowing red lights were eyes attached to a humanoid creature standing 7 feet tall and with wings folded back. They were all terrified and started speeding back to the town. A ways out of the TNT area, they saw the creature perched on a billboard. As the car sped along, Mothman chased after them, keeping pace with the car. Its wings were so colossal that Linda Scarberry later said that they would crash against the car with each wing beat. The couple drove to the courthouse to report what they saw. They even said that Mothman followed them home, watching them through the windows throughout the night. Inside the home, the couple reported poltergeist activity, which is typified by loud noises, objects being moved, thrown, or destroyed. The next morning, the couple found claw marks on the car. Following the sightings, a wave of reporters descended on Point Pleasant, and the account of Mothman was spread across the globe. Mothman's name seems to be derived from the Batman character Killer Moth. Later, deputies went to the TNT plant. They were able to find oval footprints measuring 4.5 inches across. For reference, grizzly bears can leave tracks 5 to 8 inches across. The TNT plant was reported to be one of the refuges for Mothman, but the plant experienced many strange occurrences following its closure in the late 40s. Local stories tell of spectral lights and even hauntings at the TNT plant. Following these 2 sightings, there were hundreds more, many of them repeating story details from the first 2, such as being chased or being watched. Mothman was always described as a humanoid creature with wings and eyes like lights. Just north of Point Pleasant in Parkersburg, residents reported hearing a creature walking around on their roofs. There is even a cave referred to as Mothman's lair in the area, though this largely seems to be a tale local kids share with each other. Despite all the hubbub about Mothman, his sightings were dwarfed by UFO sightings. At the time, the local paper had to set up a separate desk for UFO sightings. The sightings were being reported by everyone from military officers, local law enforcement, and regular people. During the Mothman scare, men in black were often seen around town. The men in black were a continuation on the strangeness going on at the time. Reportedly, a man in black was apparently sighted swaying back and forth chirping with birds. Some were reported drinking bowls of jello. One even threatened someone wearing poorly applied orange lipstick. Paradoxically, they seem rather inept, yet most people who encountered them reported feeling threatened. Most people agree that the end of the Mothman story in West Virginia comes to a close with the collapse of the Silver Bridge. The bridge was built in 1928 and got its name because it was the first in the area to be painted aluminum. On the evening of December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge buckled and fell into the black waters of the Ohio River. 67 people were on the bridge at the time, and 46 perished as a result of the collapse. The events are often connected by circumstantial and potentially false information, such as sightings and nightmares about the collapse following encounters with Mothman. While the sightings in West Virginia of Mothman reduced following the collapse of the Silver Bridge, sightings still happen in West Virginia, but are exceedingly rare. However, there have been eerily similar reports of Mothman-like creatures outside West Virginia. For instance, Chicago had a rash of sightings in 2020 and into 2021. Some have even connected Mothman with the Blackbird of Chernobyl. The last thing we have to consider is, what was Mothman, or was Mothman a hoax? Some people connect the rash of UFO sightings with Mothman and draw the conclusion that Mothman was in some way related. The others have posited that he was an extra-dimensional being that could shift realities at will. Some have said that due to his red eyes, he was a devil. Others have linked Mothman to descriptions of the Egyptian god Set. The last supernatural conclusion comes from a folk tale relating to the moths of Appalachia. While it's interesting to think about the supernatural answers to Mothman, sadly there's no way to prove anything definitively. So I leave those to your imagination while we talk about natural explanations. One of the most popular explanations was put forth by W. Professor Dr. Robert Smith following the Roger and Linda Scarberry sighting. He said it may be a sandhill crane. Sandhill cranes are native to Georgia, Florida, and Mississippi, but could potentially range as far north as Point Pleasant. They stand 6 feet tall with an 80-inch wingspan and have red feathers around their eyes. It's also known for being a vegetarian, and so it wouldn't harm a human, and this would explain why the German Shepherd found near the Scarberry sighting was not eaten. The other competing theory is that the whole thing was a hoax that got out of hand. There are locals who claim to have friends who would dress up as Mothman and scare people. However, they rarely divulge names for fear of bringing ridicule to them. This may also be similar to the clown scare of 2016. One name people tend to talk about is Gray Barker, a West Virginia native from Clarksburg, and something of an eclectic man. He ran a sort of curiosity shop in his hometown and wrote stories on the side. He was also friends of Albert Bender, the founder of the International Flying Saucer Bureau. From Mr. Bender, Barker learned about the Men in Black phenomenon and subsequently wrote stories about them. The reason why I bring Mr. Barker up is because following his death in the 80s, many noted that a lot of the paranormal happenings of West Virginia were often followed by a visit from Mr. Barker, from the Flatwoods Monster to the Mothman scare. Some friends, and I use that term loosely, called Mr. Barker a hoaxer. They say they wouldn't be surprised if each story hadn't been fabricated by Mr. Barker, either by dressing up or telling tall tales to make a buck. Also, one of the first major sightings in Doddridge County isn't far from Mr. Barker's home in Clarksburg. While Mr. Barker may have ginned up a few stories, it's hard to believe that he completely fabricated them or performed the hoax himself. I draw this conclusion because the West Virginia roads were largely twists and turns and a 3-hour drive from Clarksburg. Furthermore, no one can really place him at the scene when each encounter happened. The truth behind Mothman is something probably lost to time, though, but that doesn't diminish it. It's still a story that sticks with us, egging on our imagination and asking us if we believe.